Right now, the planet is hurtling beyond 1.5 degrees warming. But for the British commentariat, the real threat is this: Britain being held accountable for the damage we've done. God forbid. As the COP27 negotiations kick off, the question of loss and damage, otherwise known as climate reparations, has been pushed front and centre. And that's partly because of the pressure being put on the conference by leaders of climate-vulnerable countries. Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, gave this blistering speech.
I come from a small island state that has high ambition, but that is not able to deliver on that high ambition because the global industrial strategy that we have has fault lines in it. Our ability to access electric cars or our ability to access batteries or photovoltaic panels are constrained by those countries that have the dominant presence and can produce for themselves, but the global south remains at the mercy of the global north on these issues. But it isn't only in that. We heard Al Gore just now speak about the difference in the cost of capital to those of us in the global south. And I ask us, how many more people must speak before those of us who have the capacity to instruct our directors at the World Bank, is that called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development only for the 20th century? At the IMF, which at least has been trying more than the World Bank? How many more countries must falter, particularly in a world that is now suffering the consequences of war and inflation, and countries therefore are unable to meet the challenges of finding the necessary resources to finance their way to net zero? This world looks still too much like it did when it was part of an imperialistic empire.
Also at COP, President of both Senegal and of the African Union, Macky Sall, called on wealthier countries to make good on their Paris Agreement pledge to pay $100 billion a year in climate financing for developing countries. Sall also called for this figure to be doubled in order to cover the true cost of climate-related impacts. This pressure comes as analysis by Carbon Brief shows that wealthier countries have been falling short of existing commitments, with the US paying less than a quarter of their fair share. But one British politician that seems to be listening is Shadow Climate Minister Ed Miliband. This is what he told Laura Kuenssberg before he headed to COP.
Part of the debate is going to be about the richer part of the world paying the poorer part of the world to help them deal with carbon costs. And some people even call it reparations. Essentially, wealthy countries ought to be giving money to countries that are finding the impact of climate change very profound and difficult. Would a Labour government pay reparations to developing countries for climate change?
I don't see it as about reparations. And actually, when you talk to lots of campaigners, they don't either. This is about the issue of so-called loss and damage. This is the fact that poorer countries are facing massive effects of climate change. You know, we see it all around the world.
And we can quibble about the terminology.
Well, no, the terminology matters because lots of people are allergic to the term reparations.
Our viewers will want to know also if a Labour government would transfer large amounts of cash to the developing world, including to China. Would Labour give money to China?
It's not about China, no, it's not about China. So I don't think China isn't necessarily asking for money. Look, this is about poorer countries that are on the front line of the climate crisis. Pakistan had these disastrous floods recently, 30% of the country underwater. So this is about global solidarity. I mean, yes, we have some historical responsibility, but this is about global solidarity, and it's absolutely part of our aid commitment. You know, we don't think the government was right to cut the 0.7 aid commitment.
But so you would, just to be clear, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but to be clear, a Labour
absolutely,
government would
it's about supporting poorer countries, completely right. And let me just say, it's morally right, Laura, but it's also in our self-interest too. Because if we don't act and if we don't help countries around the world, we're going to end up with the problems that countries face in terms of refugees, for example, coming back onto us.
Except that China is part of the group of countries that is asking for loss and damage, to use the COP terminology.
We should recognise loss and damage, absolutely.
Including for a country with as much money for China.
It's not about giving money to China. I promise you, Laura, it's not about giving money to China. That's not what this is about. This is about countries like the Maldives, like Pakistan and others. And we have aid commitments. Now, unfortunately, the government government has resiled from many of our aid commitments, but it is absolutely about recognising our moral responsibility.
Recognising our moral responsibility? That doesn't sound very British. Following Miliband's interview, Sunak went out of his way to rule out climate reparations, stating he would instead prioritise green investment that supports British jobs. As expected, talk of compensation for loss and damage has made the right-wing commentariat lose their collective minds. Writing in The Times, Tim Montgomery said this: "The idea of reparations is one-sided nonsense." Explaining why, he followed up with, "While our consumption footprint is undoubtedly outsized, more than 80% of Nobel Science and other prizes have been awarded to Western nations, reflecting what we have given to global civilization." So, a few Nobel Prizes versus disproportionate historical responsibility for the existential catastrophe that is climate change. I think those two cancel each other out, no? Echoing this sentiment, real-life caricature Alison Pearson wrote in The Telegraph, "We don't owe developing countries climate reparations. They owe us." Giving in to specious emotional blackmail from developing nations when your own countrymen are facing enormous hardship is not wrong, it's just immoral. Charming. What Pearson is trying to do there is essentially pit working class people in Britain dealing with the cost of living crisis against those in the global south facing the brunt of climate breakdown. And yes, we do need vast sums of money to do this, trillions of dollars for decarbonisation, hundreds of billions for loss and damage. But these figures could be covered by so many different ways. Ending global subsidies for the fossil fuel industry would free up nearly $6 trillion annually. A climate damages tax on the fossil fuel industry could raise $1 trillion a year. And defunding armies and militarized policing, well, that could open up $1.9 trillion. That would go a long way to financing the kinds of infrastructures needed for the global south to deal with climate change. And if that means fewer wars, taxing billion-dollar companies, and the winding down of the fossil fuel industry, well, I think that'll work out pretty well for working class people everywhere, including in Britain. Michael, why has the simple concept of polluters paying for climate damage got the British commentariat shaking like this?
On the one hand, and I think the point Ed Miliband was probably making is, the reason the word reparation seems to get people's back up is because it's like, well, I'm not personally responsible for all of these emissions that were released over the past few decades, et cetera, et cetera. Why should I have to pay? Now, I mean, that doesn't really make sense because it would be the government that does it. So we as a collective are represented by the government, and we as a collective have emitted an awful lot of carbon emissions over previous decades. And yes, for a lot of that period, we knew climate change was happening and we knew it was a problem. Obviously, people say, well, we didn't know in the Industrial Revolution that climate change was going to happen. We can't be held to account because we burnt so much coal at the turn of the 19th and the turn of the 20th century. Reasonable, but I mean, we did a lot of it once climate change had begun. One reason why politicians sort of like on a technocratic level are also really opposed to this is because they're worried that if you set a precedent that we have to pay for the damage we've done, they're like, well, where would it end? And that's very telling in and of itself, because if you say, oh no, we can't set a precedent that when you cause damage, you have to pay to clear it up because that could bankrupt us. And obviously the implicit assumption or the implicit recognition there, in fact, is that we've caused so much damage that were countries to have, or people or communities to have any means, any recourse to get compensation for the damage we've done, that could completely bankrupt us. Now, what does that say about us as a country? Another thing there, I think Rishi Sunak's statement was, I mean, obviously Alison Pearson's and Tim Montgomery's statements were particularly ridiculous, but Rishi Sunak's one was, I think, just as frustrating. This idea, we won't put forward money for loss and damage, which, let's be clear, this is countries where climate change through very little fault of their own, I mean, virtually no fault of their own. Like, we're often talking about Pacific islands here, countries which are going to be completely decimated, destroyed by climate change. Pakistan as well, as Ed Miliband mentioned, a third of the country was underwater for a period this year. Countries with very little responsibility for climate change, who are going to be, in many ways, huge parts of their nations destroyed, huge parts of their economies destroyed. And the idea of loss and damage is to say, if we are responsible for emitting all of this carbon and producing this problem for them, and also we do have the means to help out. By the way, we are richer than them, right? I think that's what Laura Kuhn says. Are we going to give money to China? This idea, well, China's richer. China isn't richer than us, by the way. Also, as Ed Miliband said, they're not really asking for this. That's not what they China doesn't go into these meetings saying, can you give us money, because they can make it themselves, right? This is countries who are in very, very vulnerable positions and are quite poor. And they're saying, look, you caused this problem. Can you give us, some money to compensate that? It's somewhat different. I was talking to Simon Lewis on Monday. It's somewhat different to the adaptation and the mitigation funds, which are somewhat less politically controversial because they don't imply any sort of guilt. But even that, we haven't met our commitment. So I think, for I think more than a decade now, I think since 2009, we have promised £100 billion per year for mitigation and adaptation. We still haven't met it. Now, developing countries quite rightly are saying there's this third issue, actually, which is loss and damage. There's some damage from climate change which we cannot adapt to minimize the damage. If you're a small island that's going to be underwater if sea levels rise, what adaptation can you do? And that's why they're saying we need cash. We need cash to compensate us for this damage. There's no point in even pretending this is about adapting anymore. That's what's going on here. I also think the Tim Montgomery thing is so ridiculous. Like, oh no, we've made loads of Nobel Prize winners. Now, like the ledger between Nobel Prize winners and climate change, you can have a very interesting philosophical debate about it. But fundamentally, what you've got here is a situation where people much poorer than ourselves are having their livelihoods destroyed, their communities destroyed because of climate change. We are responsible for that. We have the money. We do have the capacity to deal with that as a country. And we are saying no. And you can't say, oh, we've got these scientists. Why are they asking us for this? Can the rich world not have had great scientists and great scientific development and also not be completely selfish when it comes to a problem that we caused? I don't see why those two things should be in opposition.